So Chris Hedges was on Current Affairs. I'm not sure if everyone is familiar with this show, but he had an interview, and the discussion is war zones and prisons, and he's comparing the two. And I want you to listen to this part of the conversation. So I'm going to go ahead and play this for you. Let's get this started. So here we go.
I think people don't necessarily realize just how horrific some of the conditions in American prisons are. I mean, they vary from place to place, but you describe some things in the book, like, you know, people being kept in solitary confinement who their toilets don't flush intentionally, and they're kept there with their own waste for days at a time. I mean, this is just, I mean, it's just the most horrific condition you could imagine plunging a human being into and keeping them there. And that's going on all the time, every day, all around the country that we inhabit.
Right, to a certain segment of the population.
Right.
Not to you and me. But if you're poor, that's and especially if you're Black, that is, you know, a common experience to you, or probably someone you know, and probably someone in your family.
I want to jump in here for just a second. I'm so glad that he mentioned that, because that's very important for people to know. You notice Chris Hedges said, well, not for people like you and me, but more so for people who are poor, and especially for people who are Black. And this is one of the things that I've brought up a couple of times on this show. People that have money that get into legal situations, if you have the money to get you out of that situation, you're less likely to spend time in prison. Look around. We see it happen with celebrities often. Now, there are some exceptions. For example, R. Kelly is an exception. That's the most recent one I can think of at the moment, actually. But there are some exceptions here and there. But usually with the exceptions, there's so much evidence that they have no choice but to do the right thing. Most of the time, people who are wealthy that have the money, they can prevent serving time, or they'll do very little time, or they'll do some type of community service. And this has happened for a long time in this country. And that's why I always say it's not really a justice system. It's an injustice system. And the system benefits people who are wealthy, most of the time, people who are white, and also people who have the resources and the means to get around that system. And if you do not have that, you'll end up like what Chris Hedges was talking about. Awkward was on this show a while back, and Awkward was mentioning that some of the prisoners that he would go and visit, because Awkward also does this, he's a part of 10 Demands, and he talks to prisoners as well. He said that some of the people that are in prison, they're not even necessarily guilty. They're sitting there because they can't place bail. And so even when we talk about bail with the criminal justice system, again, that goes back to having economic means. That goes back to the people who are wealthy versus the people who are poor. And people who are poor, like Chris Hedges was just talking about, 9 times out of 10, it's going to be harder for them to come up with the bail money. So they'll just be sitting there waiting trial because they don't have the bail money to get out. That's also part of the reason why some of the prisons and jails are overcrowded. I'm going to go back into the video.
So yeah, the scene you describe is one of my students, Steph, who I just will, as an aside, gets out, graduates summa cum laude from Rutgers. It's a Rutgers program. It's a great program, NJ STEP, in that if they have a 3.1 average, they can actually get out and matriculate to Rutgers. Some of them finish their degree in the prison, but they can actually go to the campus. So he's sold a clandestine cell phone by a guard. There's all sorts of corruption, that's how drugs usually get into a prison, or any kind of contraband. And he's caught with it, and he's sent into solitary confinement for a year for a cell phone, which has left lasting psychological scars. And he's put in one of these cells where there is no toilet. It's a hole in the wall. And the feces and urine is collected every few days. So the stench is just permeates the entire tier. There are actually cells in the prison in Trenton, New Jersey, that were former horse stalls. But the prison's quite old. And again, they have there's no toilet. There's no running water. And part of the things they will do when they put you, after there's an altercation or they're attempting to investigate something that's happened in the prison, they'll move you to what they call the hole while you're waiting to determine whether or not you've committed this infraction, and you'll go into solitary. And
I want to chime in here for just a second. Let's talk about solitary confinement, which I feel is one of the most inhumane things that can be done to a person, whether you're a prisoner or not. Solitary confinement, imagine being trapped inside of a room, a tiny room, and depending on what the type of prison it is, it could be a small room, or it could just be what looks like a dungeon, okay, if you've seen them. You have no sunlight most of the time, no window. You're in complete darkness most of the time. There may not be a light, nothing in there, but maybe just a toilet, or if there's even that. He just told you some of these places don't even have that. You have no interaction with people. Someone slides you your food through a little slot in the door. I want everybody to think about what happened when the pandemic first hit. For those of us that lived in states that locked down, I'm one of them. Massachusetts shut completely down. I remember the first week I was okay. When we went into the second and the third week and we were shut down for a while, I started to get a little stir crazy, started to get a little cabin fever. Not being able to see people, not being able to have any type of interaction, especially for people who are extroverts, it was painful. It's a painful experience. It can cause psychological issues. Yes, Juliet is right. It will break your mind. Absolutely. Absolutely. Imagine not being able to communicate with anybody, not being able to see anyone. You're just stuck in a hole by yourself. I don't think that solitary confinement should be allowed. I never did. I don't agree with it. Because the point of the prison system is supposed to rehabilitate people. I don't feel the prison system that we have in the United States actually does that. Now, there are prison systems in this world that do. I was watching a documentary, I think this was about a year ago. Norway. They were showing a prison in Norway that honestly looked like an apartment complex. The prisoners had their own rooms. There were no cells. These little rooms were kind of like a dorm room that you have in college. They had a key to their dorm room. They can come and go as they please. And the difference was they actually rehabilitate the prisoners. I have to find that documentary, you guys. I can't remember the name of it. I'll have to ask my husband because I think he was the one that actually found it. But the freedom that they had. And the reporter who was interviewing the prisoners was asking them, like, so they just trust that you guys will do what you're supposed to do? They just trust that you're not going to try to violate any rules. You're not going to try to hurt anyone. You're not going to try to escape. And one of the prisoners said, well, no, why would we do that? The whole point is rehabilitation. And you could see the difference with the prisoners in Norway, that they were actually being rehabilitated. That was the big difference. That doesn't happen in the system that we have in the United States. It really does not. The system we have here is meant to break you. And I don't feel you get rehabilitation that way. I'm going to go back into the video.
They can put you in what they call a dry cell, which means there's no water. They will use sensory deprivation, constant light, constant cold, constant heat to break you down. This is normal practice within American prisons. And then at its cruder form, and I actually, for the New York Times, went down and did a story about the parish jail in New Orleans, where the guards were organizing gladiatorial combat for the people in the jail. And jails are actually worse than prison. A lot of my students just want to get out of the county jail any way possible. There's no program. They're locked in there 23, 24 hours a day. The conditions, it's kind of a relief sometimes to get into a prison. But they were giving prisoners, this was in New Orleans, garbage can lids and mop handles and making them attack each other in kind of battalions. And so, yeah, the savagery that takes place within the prison system, 80,000 of our citizens as I speak are in solitary confinement. And 6 days is what my students say of after solitary, you begin to start to go crazy. And a lot of people break down, which is kind of the purpose. And then what they do is they drug you up. They give you psychotropic drugs and you're just into zombies. I mean, it's you sleep all day, your hands shake, you shuffle down the hall. 25% of the people, because we don't have a healthcare system that deals adequately with mental health issues for the poor, 25% of the prison system have severe mental health issues and they don't get therapy, they don't get treatment, they're re-traumatized and drugged up.
Yeah. There's, the...
Yeah, I do want to say something about that too. That definitely does something to someone's mental state as well. The fact that they would even have prisoners fight each other on purpose. They are treating them like animals. That's not a part of rehabilitation. And this is also the reason why some prisoners, when they do get out, they end up right back in prison because they really have not been rehabilitated. If you've been in prison for 15 years and you're set free and you go back into society, the world that you knew has changed. Imagine going into prison before social media. You come out, you don't know what is a tick to a talk. You don't know what Twitter really is. And that's how a lot of people communicate today. It's like you have to readjust your mind to adapt to a new society that has been here all this time, but you didn't know about it because you've been locked away for 15 years. You have to do that. And on top of that, you have to find a job. And that's a hard part because a lot of companies don't want to hire someone that has a record. So what happens? This is how someone who may have been a drug dealer becomes a repeat offender. You go back out into the world, you can't find a job, but you got to make money so that you can eat, so that you can live, so you can have a place to stay. What happens? People go right back out on the street and start selling. Get caught again, right back in the system. When you have a record in this country, you are a target for law enforcement. It'll be really difficult, very difficult for you. And then on top of that, if you're not given the skills that you need to succeed when you come back into the real world, who's going to hire you with that? How are you going to get a job in the real world if you went to jail before social media started? You don't know how to use these applications. You're not tech savvy. What are you going to do? So this is the biggest problem I have with our criminal justice system. They don't actually rehabilitate anybody. They're not teaching people how to survive when they get out. Henry said, I had a customer I was showing how to use a smartphone. He had just got out of 18 years of prison. Really felt for this guy. See what I mean? It's a totally different world. I'm going to go to some of the comments and I'm going to go back into the video. Sebastian said, what's truly an insult to injury is that despite legalization, people are still in prison for drug-related offenses. Well said, Sebastian, and that's a problem in my state, 100%. That is something that I have contacted Governor Baker about multiple times. The fact that they have legalized marijuana here in Massachusetts, it's been legal for a couple of years, and we have dispensaries here, and they continue to grow in the state, and you haven't done anything about the people who are still in prison here that have been criminalized for marijuana. Those people should be set free. Is kind of like this double standard that I don't approve of. If you can open up a shop and you can sell it, then the people who went to prison for it should be let go. Let them go. Let them go. Quaker Anarchist said, I lived in Nepal and lived with entire people who live in honesty and trust. Just honesty and trust. Norwegian immigrants had the same orientation, thus dumb blonde because they didn't orient to take advantage. Interesting. Franny says the U.S. prison system amounts to modern day enslavement of Black people. Bingo. Delthea says when your morality comes from a belief in an internal threat of hell for transgressions, you don't rehabilitate people, you rebuke them. That's a good point. Thank you so much for the super chat, Donnie. Lee, tell her about Zeitgeist Movement. She should interview Peter Joseph. You're like the third person to tell me that. I need to write that down so I don't forget, because people mention names to me and sometimes I forget. Thank you so much for the super chat. Harry said the US has just 4% of the world's population, but 25% of the world's prison population. Thank you so much for that, Harry. We tend to have harsher punishment here in the United States when you compare us to some of the other, not all the countries, but some of the other countries. And I've always said this before, the fact that people were in prison for weed, it's kind of insane when you think about it now. Joe Biden's crime bill, of course, didn't help with this. Didn't help at all. It is a for-profit system. So I'm going to go back into the video. Oh, I don't know where it went. Okay, thanks, Eric. Add it to the stream. All right, so let me go back into this. There's another question he asked them. So listen to this.
The good thing is that in recent years, partially because of Michelle Alexander's work, which you mentioned in the book that you teach to your students, there's been a great deal more attention to the problem of mass incarceration. But it is still the case that a lot of it is discussed in ways that are statistical or abstract. We hear the words solitary confinement, we hear mass incarceration, we hear the numbers on how many people America has locked away in its prisons. But the visceral first-person reality of life in an American prison is, I think that, one of the services that your book does, it really opens this institution up for inspection. And you've got scenes in here that I'm never going to forget. I mean, the whole thing with the communication through the toilet bowl phone that you describe at some length. I mean, when you actually start hearing about what life is actually really like, and how people improvise, how ordinary people improvise under incredibly trying conditions of deprivation, you really begin to empathize more.
Yeah, well, that's why I wrote it, and I think there are some very good books on the carceral system. But you're right, and Michelle Alexander writes more about I think it's a great book, but it's more about the breakdown of the legal system, where these people railroaded into the prison system without getting any kind of adequate judicial representation. And then we also have to acknowledge, courtesy of Bill Clinton and Joe Biden, that sentences are disproportionate to what they are anywhere else in the world. I always tell my students, I ask them, guess how many years Gabriel Princip got for assassinating the heir to the Austro-Hungarian throne and his wife, Sophie. 20. I got people who are serving life and they've never been charged with a violent crime. So the sentences themselves are so draconian. I mean, I have one student, brilliant student, he was in for, I think, 26 years. He gets out, and because they've just turned them into warehouses, they're not getting any training. The college programs is not funded by the state; it's funded by donated by foundations, and it's driven out of its based at Rutgers. So he gets out. He has no vocational skills. His partner gets pregnant. They have a child that is born premature at 23 months. He's on oxygen.
Did you hear what he just said? He said he gets out of prison and he has no vocational skills. This is what I was talking about. Like, they don't really give them the skills that they need when they're in prison, so that when they get out of prison, they can lead a productive lifestyle. They'll be ready for the job market. They don't do that.
Oxygen 24 hours a day. He doesn't have any money. He can't pay the medical bills. And so he starts to sell drugs. And he's picked up, and I went up to Goshen, New York to sit through his sentencing, and he's given 2.5 years, leaving the mother, alone with the child. And his lawyer, I met with his lawyer beforehand, and he said, oh, well, I read he was in a robbery. He didn't kill anyone. He was in a robbery. I read what he was in prison for in New Jersey. In New York State, he would have gotten 3 or 4 years. So it's also this disparity. There's no rhyme or reason to the sentences. And then of course you've got the 3 strikes you're out laws. Kevin Sharp, who's now Leonard Peltier's lawyer, was a federal judge. He kind of quit because he said, I'm sending people to life for prison who shouldn't go for life. The whole system, they say the system doesn't work. Unfortunately, the system works exactly as it is designed to work. And it's now become a multi-billion-dollar a year industry, not because of private prisons. There are private prisons. ICE uses a lot of them. But because everything in the prison has become privatized. The food service, Aramark, and you have all cases of food poisoning in the Florida prison.
The description of that, of some of the food.
Okay. So that's what I wanted to show you from that interview, because it's a longer interview. Definitely check out the whole interview. It's on YouTube. The channel is called Current Affairs. And I just know that he has a point when he says the system is working exactly the way it was designed to work. And this is another thing that Joe Biden could have done to redeem his past. He could have come forward and said, you know what? We're going to put an end to the private prison system. We're going to cut that out. You know what? We're going to decriminalize marijuana in this country. But Joe Biden's not going to do that because he knows how his bread is buttered, and he wants them to continue to butter his bread. He knows exactly who he serves and what he stands for. And it does not include the American people. And I, for one, think that everybody deserves a second chance. And if you think about some of the messages that came from the Black Panthers, if you think about some of the speeches that Fred Hampton gave, you're supposed to have this type of redemption. Like, people should be able to be redeemed, right? There's supposed to be transformative justice. And what I see with our prison system, I don't feel like there is transformative justice, because when you get out, for those who do get out of prison, they're still shunned in society and they're prevented from actually living a productive lifestyle, whether they were in prison for weed or they were in prison for burglary. And that's what I want everyone to understand, because regardless of the crime, if you've been in for, especially you've been in for a couple years, everybody got to check that box on their job application, whether or not they have served time, especially if it's federal. And so you already have a feat against you as soon as you get out. You could be ready to change your whole life and start anew, but you already have doors slammed in your face because of the past. If you served your time, you served your time, but it goes along with you throughout life. That's the problem. People will always look at you differently. People will always treat you differently. There are some companies that will not want to hire you. In fact, probably a lot of them would not want to hire you. Now, there are some that do take in ex-inmates. Waffle House. I don't know if you guys are familiar with Waffle House. It's like a diner, 24-hour place, jam. It's more popular in the South, but they are known to hire people who just came out of prison. But let's be real, they don't pay much either. So it's really disappointing. And I feel that we do not have transformative justice when I look at our prison system, when I look at our criminal justice system. I feel like once you have that strike, once you have that mark on your record, you are forever treated differently and your life is forever changed. And that's unfortunate. Franny says the US prison system amounts to a modern day enslavement of Black people. Well said. Charlotte says the movie was Where to Invade Next, directed by Michael Moore. Yes, yes. I should have known it was a Michael Moore documentary. He showed the good things in other countries we should adopt. Thank you for that, Charlotte. I forgot the name of it. Thank you for the super chat, Delthea Simmons. Your environment triggered, allowed, and promoted criminal behavior. So now let's put you back in that environment and demand you do better and then wonder why you don't. Boom. Bingo. Bingo. Thank you for the super chat. I'm Sweet Leaf says, I have a friend doing life federally for drugs on a system created that uses points to determine just judgment. He added up as a habitual, no weapons, no other crimes life. It's so sad. It's so sad. Lucky Burrito says, Namaste, Sabby. What's going on, Lucky Burrito? Delthea said, I don't think it's anybody's business if you serve time. You paid that debt. You don't keep paying for a Big Mac you ate 2 weeks ago. I like that quote, Delthea. I like that saying. That's a good point. Very good point.